Beyond the Gates Recap Full Fridays update January 23, 2026. Ted Richardson had convinced himself that Fairmont Crest Country Club was one of the few places left where history could be politely ignored. The manicured lawns, the soft clink of crystal glasses, and the carefully curated silence between powerful people were meant to erase discomfort, not summon it. Yet the moment he looked up and saw Nicole Dupree step through the entrance, accompanied by Carlton Fitzgerald, every carefully constructed illusion collapsed. This was not simply an awkward coincidence. It was the past deliberately walking back into his line of sight, uninvited and unrestrained. Ted's reaction betrayed him before his composure could catch up. The recognition came instantly, followed by the unmistakable tension that still lingered between himself and the man now standing beside his ex-wife. Time had passed, papers had been signed, lives had supposedly moved on, but none of that mattered in that instant. What mattered was that unresolved history had teeth, and it was smiling politely across the room. Nicole and Carlton moved with an ease that was impossible to fake. Their body language carried the quiet confidence of two people who had already survived scrutiny and chosen each other anyway. There was no hesitation in their steps, no sign that the presence of Ted Richardson altered their reality in any meaningful way. If anything, it only underscored how far Nicole had come from the version of herself that once tried to make that marriage work. She was not there to provoke Ted, yet her very presence did exactly that. For Ted, the humiliation was not rooted in jealousy alone, but in the realization that Nicole's happiness no longer required his acknowledgement. Carlton's role in that happiness was impossible to ignore, and worse, impossible to challenge without revealing how deeply threatened Ted still felt. The hostility between Ted and Carlton had never truly cooled, despite the polite distance they had maintained since Nicole's divorce. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered quietly, fueled by professional rivalry, wounded pride, and the unspoken belief that one man had replaced another in ways that went far beyond romance. Ted had always told himself that Carlton was a temporary complication, a rebound masquerading as permanence. Seeing them together now, calm and unbothered, forced Ted to confront an uncomfortable truth. Carlton was no longer an interruption in Nicole's life, but a fixture. The country club, once a symbol of Ted's social dominance, suddenly felt like neutral territory where he held no advantage at all. Complicating matters further was the looming presence of Dr. Keel Rollins, whose return this week threatened to destabilize relationships that had only just begun to feel settled. Keel's history with Nicole, layered with unresolved emotional and professional entanglements, had the potential to reopen wounds that Nicole and Carlton had worked hard to close. Yet, even with that shadow hanging over them, Nicole and Carlton appeared unshaken. Their bond, at least for now, seemed rooted in mutual understanding rather than convenience, suggesting that whatever storms lay ahead, they intended to face them together. For Ted, this only deepened the sense of exclusion. He was no longer at the center of Nicole's narrative, nor was he positioned as a pivotal antagonist. He was simply part of the background, watching the story continue without him. Elsewhere in Fairmont Crest, tension brewed in a far more dangerous form. Leslie Thomas, never one to speak without intention, delivered a warning that carried the weight of calculated menace. Her words suggested that someone nearby was playing a long game, manipulating events with the belief that patience alone would guarantee victory. Leslie's implication that time was running out transformed that belief into a liability. In Fairmont Crest, long games rarely ended quietly. They ended with exposure, betrayal, or irreversible loss. The ambiguity of her target only heightened the threat. Leslie was not known for empty warnings, and whoever found themselves on the receiving end of her message was already closer to the edge than they realized. All signs pointed toward Joey Armstrong as the most likely recipient of Leslie's provocation. Their history was defined by mutual distrust, each viewing the other as both obstacle and opportunity. Leslie's tendency to push boundaries was well documented, but Joey was not a man who absorbed pressure passively. If provoked, he would respond, and not always in ways that could be predicted or contained. Fairmont Crest had seen this pattern before: a sharp remark, a calculated insult, and then a chain reaction that exposed vulnerabilities no one intended to reveal. Leslie's warning, whether directed at Joey or another unseen player, signaled that the delicate balance of power in the community was beginning to tilt. What made the situation especially volatile was the interconnected nature of these conflicts. Ted's unresolved bitterness, Nicole's newfound stability, Carlton's quiet confidence, Keel's impending return, Leslie's veiled threat, and Joey's volatile pride were not isolated storylines. They were strands of the same web, tightening with each passing moment. Fairmont Crest thrived on appearances, but appearances were only effective when everyone agreed to maintain them. This week suggested that such agreement was unraveling. Old resentments resurfaced, new alliances hardened, and long-standing grudges edged closer to confrontation. Ted, in particular, stood at a crossroads he did not yet recognize. His discomfort at the country club was more than a social embarrassment. It was a warning that his relevance within this circle was being quietly renegotiated. The power he once wielded through marriage, reputation, and control no longer functioned the way it used to. Nicole's independence, combined with Carlton's presence, stripped Ted of the leverage he had relied upon for years. Whether he chose to adapt or lash out would determine how this chapter of his life unfolded, but either choice carried consequences he could no longer avoid. As the week progressed, the atmosphere in Fairmont Crest promised to grow increasingly unstable. Beneath polite smiles and restrained conversations lay the certainty that something was about to break. Leslie's warning lingered like a ticking clock, its rhythm felt even by those who pretended not to hear it. Joey's inevitable response threatened to ignite a conflict that would pull others into its orbit, whether they were prepared or not. Meanwhile, Ted's unresolved resentment risked pushing him toward decisions driven by wounded pride rather than strategy. Beyond the gates of Fairmont Crest, life continued as usual, but inside, the carefully maintained order showed visible cracks. The coming days would test loyalties, expose hidden motives, and force each player to confront the reality they had been avoiding. In a community built on control, perception, and power, the greatest danger was not confrontation itself, but the moment when everyone realized that the game they thought they were playing had already changed and the time to adjust was running out. While tension simmered elsewhere in Fairmont Crest, another confrontation unfolded behind closed doors at Orphe Jean's, where Catherine Cott Richardson found herself sharing space with Ted in a setting that was meant to feel neutral, even comforting. Instead, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken grievances. Cott's bitterness had reached a point where restraint felt pointless, her anger sharpened by months of watching the same patterns repeat themselves. To her, Ted's choices were no longer merely disappointing. They were insulting, especially when viewed through the lens of everything she believed he had failed to protect. The resentment she carried was not just about one woman or one mistake, but about a lifetime of compromises she had been forced to accept in silence. Being in the same room with him now only magnified that sense of betrayal, turning every small gesture into evidence that he still refused to fully understand the damage he had caused. Ted, for his part, appeared emotionally exhausted rather than defensive. The constant expectation that he should apologize, explain, and justify himself had worn thin, particularly where Eva Thomas was concerned. What Cott interpreted as moral outrage, Ted saw as relentless judgment that left no room for growth or closure. His frustration stemmed from a belief that he had already paid for his mistakes in ways Cott refused to acknowledge. In his mind, the era of repentance had run its course, replaced by a need to reclaim authority over his own narrative. The dynamic between father and daughter felt increasingly adversarial, as if neither could speak without reopening wounds the other was desperate to forget. What should have been a private reckoning instead became another reminder that forgiveness, once withheld too long, mutates into something far more corrosive. Cott's fixation on Eva was not accidental. Eva represented everything Cott feared Ted would never learn from, a symbol of manipulation, instability, and chaos disguised as allure. To Cott, Ted's involvement with someone like Eva was proof that he remained dangerously susceptible to flattery and control, no matter how many times it led to disaster. Her anger was rooted in fear as much as contempt, fear that Ted's choices would once again ripple outward and damage everyone caught in his orbit. Yet beneath that fear lay something more painful, the realization that Ted no longer seemed interested in earning her approval. The power dynamic had shifted, leaving Cott feeling unheard and increasingly isolated within her own family. At the same time, another storyline quietly escalated across town, one that threatened to destabilize far more than a single relationship. Inside Bill Hamilton's office, Donnie Dupree crossed a line that had already been dangerously blurred. The intimacy between them was undeniable, charged with a familiarity that suggested this was not their first moment of weakness. Donnie's presence carried a magnetic intensity, the kind that demanded attention and validation in equal measure. Bill, ever drawn to strength and confidence, seemed unable or unwilling to resist the pull. His admiration for Donnie was not merely romantic. It was rooted in how she reflected the version of himself he most liked to believe in, powerful, untouchable, and admired. What made the moment especially significant was Bill's lack of resistance. His failure to stop what was unfolding spoke volumes, revealing a willingness to surrender control, if only briefly. For Donnie, this was not just about desire, but about affirmation. Being seen, celebrated, and desired by someone like Bill reinforced her sense of worth at a time when her own identity felt increasingly precarious. The kiss, when it came, was less an impulsive act than the inevitable result of unspoken tension that had been building for far too long. Both understood the implications, yet neither chose to step away. This development carried serious consequences, particularly within the tightly woven social fabric of Fairmont Crest. Donnie's actions risked igniting old rivalries and exposing vulnerabilities she had worked hard to conceal. Bill, meanwhile, stood on the brink of repeating familiar mistakes, mistaking emotional intensity for clarity. The parallels between his situation and Ted's were impossible to ignore, suggesting that power and privilege did not insulate anyone from self-destruction. In a community where reputations were currency, even a single misstep could trigger a cascade of fallout that no amount of influence could fully contain. As these threads continued to intertwine, the underlying theme became impossible to ignore. Apologies had lost their power, restraint was eroding, and long-suppressed desires were forcing their way to the surface. Ted's refusal to continue apologizing, Cott's escalating bitterness, Donnie's calculated vulnerability, and Bill's surrender to temptation all pointed toward a broader unraveling. Fairmont Crest was entering a phase where emotional debts would be collected, whether the people involved were prepared to pay them or not. The coming days promised not resolution, but escalation. Relationships strained by pride and unresolved resentment were inching closer to breaking points, and every decision made in frustration or longing carried the potential for irreversible damage. What began as private moments of tension and intimacy threatened to spill into the open, reshaping alliances and exposing truths that could no longer be contained. In Fairmont Crest, the illusion of control was fading fast, and the consequences of ignoring that reality were about to become impossible to deny.